Dean Braxton, a man living and working in King County, Seattle, Washington, once lived a life he loved dearly. As a supervisor in the juvenile court's probation department, he always found joy in his work, especially when helping teenagers get a second chance in life. Dean thought he would do this job until the end of his life, but little did he know that it would come true literally on May 5, 2006. On that fateful day, Dean experienced severe pain, which he quickly recognized as being caused by kidney stones. This wasn't the first time he had endured this condition, so he was quite confident that he could get through it as he had before. He thought that if he just endured the pain for a while, it would eventually subside, and everything would be fine. However, this time, things did not go as expected. The pain not only persisted but worsened, forcing him to go to the hospital for treatment. When he arrived at the emergency room, Dean remained calm, since he had been through similar situations before. He informed the medical staff that he had kidney stones and knew what needed to be done. The doctors immediately took him to a private room and administered morphine to ease the pain. At the same time, he was diagnosed with a kidney infection, and the doctors prescribed antibiotics to treat it. Dean was asked to stay overnight at the hospital, prepare for the surgery to remove the stones the next morning. The surgery went smoothly the following day, and the kidney stones were broken down. However, no one could have foreseen the dangerous events that would follow. The doctors later discovered that Dean's body did not respond to the prescribed antibiotics, causing the infection to worsen. The toxins from the broken stones quickly entered his bloodstream, leading to sepsis. All of Dean's organs, including his heart and lungs, began to shut down. According to medical records, he was declared clinically dead for about an hour and 45 minutes. However, what Dean remembers most about this moment is not fear or panic. As a Christian, he had a strong belief that when he died, his soul would be with God. This belief brought him peace during the final moments of his life. When he realized he was dying, the only thought in his mind was, "I'm going home." Dean's passing wasn't slow, but rather rapid and forceful, as if he were shot out of his body, rushing through the hospital floors. Dean recalls leaving his body, passing through the hospital ceiling, into the blue sky, and into outer space. He tried to comprehend the speed at which he was moving, but it seemed faster than anything imaginable by human. In the blink of an eye, Dean had left the physical world and entered a dark space, but at the end of that space, a light appeared. He described the light not as a faint glow at the end of a tunnel, but as a window where the light welcomed him. He wasn't sure if it was a real window, but that was how he perceived it. When he entered that light, everything became clear and peaceful. There was no more pain, and no discomfort existed in his body. Dean described heaven as a place where everything was perfect. Nothing would upset or annoy you. He felt a sense of harmony and belonging that he had never experienced before. He realized that while he was alive, he always felt out of place. But here, he knew he was where he belonged. Everything in heaven welcomed Dean. From the trees to the flowers, all of creation seemed to rejoice in his arrival. Dean felt love and acceptance not only from Jesus or God the Father, but from everything around him. He recounted that even the trees and flowers seemed to say they were happy because of his presence. This made Dean realize that heaven is not just a place, but an entirely different state of existence. Dean Braxton continued his story with unforgettable experiences in heaven. After feeling welcomed by all of creation around him, he realized that the most important goal wasn't just to be in heaven. His strongest desire, which he hadn't even realized before, was to meet Jesus. To him, heaven would not be heaven without the presence of Jesus and God the Father. It wasn't about the place, but about the person he longed to meet, the one who created heaven. Dean described his journey through a dense forest, but he didn't feel lost or afraid. He knew that Jesus was on the other side of the forest, and everything around him seemed to assist his journey. The trees parted before him as if they were saying, "He's going to see the king. He's going to see the king." This feeling only made Dean more certain that where he was going was his ultimate destination. When he finally stepped out of the forest and into a vast open space, before him stood Jesus, who was speaking to a group of angels and redeemed souls. Dean stood in awe of the glory of the Savior, who had died on the cross to redeem humanity. To him, Jesus was the center of heaven, the source of all the love and salvation he felt. Dean described the first moment he approached Jesus. Instead of standing tall and looking directly at his face, he felt unworthy of doing so. He knelt down, his eyes only daring to look at Jesus' feet. He recounted that when he looked up slightly to see his feet, he felt an overwhelming love emanating from every part of Jesus' body. From his feet to his ankles to his legs, everything radiated unconditional love for him. Dean felt that Jesus loved him in a way he had never experienced before. When Dean finally looked up at Jesus' face, what surprised him most wasn't his greatness or majesty. Instead, Jesus' gaze made him feel as though he had never committed any wrong in his entire life. Dean realized that when God forgives, truly forgets all the sins that humans have committed. He recalled the Bible's words in Hebrews chapters 8 and 10, which state that when God forgives, he never remembers those sins again. This became a reality for Dean as he stood before Jesus, feeling like an innocent child who had never sinned. The encounter with Jesus didn't stop at forgiveness. Dean realized that everything he had experienced in his life, including his presence in heaven at that moment, was because of Jesus' sacrifice. He knew that without Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, he would never have had the opportunity to stand here, in this heaven filled with love. Dean even felt that Jesus had created heaven not just for humanity in general, but specifically for him. Personalized care and love he had never felt anywhere else. After experiencing the boundless love of Jesus through his gaze and presence, Dean began to receive a series of what he called downloads. Like a computer being loaded with data, Dean felt that Jesus was imparting important truths into his mind and heart. He couldn't fully describe what Jesus taught him, but he knew they were profound truths about life, God, and the mission he would have to fulfill when he returned to earth. However, just when Dean felt ready to stay in heaven forever, Jesus turned to him and said something he had not expected. "It's not your time yet. Go back." At that moment, Dean felt as though his whole world had collapsed. He didn't want to leave heaven, but he understood that Jesus had another plan for him. He knew that his time in heaven wasn't entirely over, but he would have to return to earth to carry out the mission Jesus had given him. After receiving the command from Jesus, Dean began his journey back. But instead of walking through the forest like before, he felt himself gliding over the treetops, as if he were flying through the beautiful natural surroundings. He didn't feel fear or worry, only joy and freedom. When he reached the boundary between heaven and earth, Dean paused for a moment, looking back at heaven with a sense of longing, then continued stepping out of heaven, returning to the life he once knew. After receiving the order from Jesus to return to earth, Dean Braxton felt an indescribable sadness. Although he knew he had to follow Jesus' command, deep down, he didn't want to leave heaven, a place where everything was perfect, peaceful, and filled with love. Before leaving, he bowed before Jesus once again, feeling the light and love from him wrapping around him. That light wasn't just physical light, but an expression of the boundless love Jesus had for all those who were Dean. As Dean resumed his journey, he didn't walk through the forest as he had done before. This time, he glided over the treetops, as though he were flying. He described how in heaven, one can move according to their will, without the limitations of physical laws as on earth. he chose to fly over the treetops and felt an immense joy, as if all creation was sharing in his happiness. He saw majestic mountains, but instead of standing still, they moved gently like ocean waves. Dean recalled that the colors and scenery in heaven were more vibrant and vivid than anything on earth. Everything possessed a beauty beyond human language's ability to fully describe. Despite how wonderful the scenery was, Dean knew his mission was to return. He continued his journey until he reached the boundary between heaven and earth. This time, instead of passing through the forest as before, he moved through another area where he saw rivers, seas, and oceans. The water there was not like the water on earth. It was a brilliant, translucent blue that shone brightly. Dean also saw many animals he had never seen before. They moved gracefully and smoothly in the heavenly landscape. Eventually, Dean once again stood before Jesus. This time, he found himself in a familiar position, a place where he had bowed before him the first time. But this time, he didn't just see Jesus. He also saw his family. On the other side of Jesus, he saw his grandmother, Mary, standing in front of a group of people. Behind her were many other family members who had passed before him, all waiting for him. They smiled at him with radiant faces, full of joy and peace. Dean felt a deep happiness seeing that his family had been reunited in heaven. One thing that moved Dean even more was seeing people he never expected to be in heaven. Before, he had thought that certain individuals couldn't make it to heaven because they didn't meet his criteria. However, through this experience, he realized that God's criteria are different from human standards. The only thing God requires is faith in Jesus Christ. Anyone who accepts Jesus will be redeemed. And this was a major lesson Dean took away from his experience. As Dean prepared to return to earth, his grandmother Mary looked at him and said, "Bring as many of us back with you as you can." This reminder implied that his mission on earth was not just to live an ordinary life, but to help others recognize Jesus' love and redemption. Dean understood that his return wasn't merely to continue living his own life, but to bring hope and faith to those around him. When he crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, Dean felt a deep sadness. He didn't want to leave, but at the same time, he knew Jesus needed him back. He returned to the hospital where his body lay on a bed. Dean remembered the moment he hovered over his body, looking down and realizing that the doctors had stopped resuscitation efforts. They had begun packing up their medical equipment, and one of them was preparing to sign the death certificate. However, the moment Dean decided to re-enter his body, everything changed. He felt himself slowly returning to reality, and immediately, the heart monitor began to beep steadily, signaling that his heart had started beating again. The doctors and nurses rushed over, resuming their work to revive him. Dean was intubated and provided with medical care to help him recover. He knew that Jesus had given him another chance to live, but the purpose of his life from now on would be different. After returning to earth, Dean felt completely transformed. He no longer viewed life the way he used to. Instead of clinging to material things or worldly achievements, he began to see everything through an eternal lens. He realized that everything in this world is temporary, and what truly matters is the life after death. Dean no longer worried about loss or suffering, because he knew that there was a place waiting for all of us after we leave this world. A place filled with love, peace, and redemption. Dean not only changed spiritually, but also in his outlook on life. He began sharing his story with others, encouraging them to believe in Jesus and live a life with the ultimate goal of being reunited with God in heaven. Dean was no longer afraid of death, because he knew that heaven was the most wonderful place a person could hope. Every day, he lived with the faith that one day he would return to heaven, but this time, he would bring more people with him, those he had helped find their way to Jesus.